Hello, I'm Gary Stearman. Welcome to another edition of Prophecy in the News. Today we're going to talk about Bible prophecy in the context of what's happening right now and in the context of our recent prophecy conference in Colorado Springs. Well, I must say that I'm totally gratified by our recent Colorado Springs Prophecy Conference, which we called the Pikes Peak Prophecy Summit, and indeed it was a summit. There was genuine excitement there. People came wanting to know what in the world is going on. I've never seen such enthusiasm to hear the Bible expounded upon. And I want to read a verse today as we begin. It is what I consider to be a key latter-day verse of prophecy in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. And it says simply this know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. Bob Ulrich, our operations director, is in studio with me today. And Bob, let's just begin with that thought. Perilous times. The audience of our recent Pikes Peak Prophecy Summit had a sense of our times. They came to us and they said, we all feel the same way. There's a kind of a unanimity of belief here. We need to hear what's happening now from the lips of people who have studied the Bible. I've never seen anything quite like it.
Well, there's a real sense of urgency in the world right now. Perilous times are here. We see things happening at such a rapid pace now that it's hard for the student of prophecy to really keep up. I think the big thing to remember as you watch today is, the Bible was written, much of it over 2,500 years ago. We're not looking into a crystal ball here. We're not studying the prophecies of Nostradamus. We're studying the prophecies of the Bible that tell us things that were written far back, but these things are happening today, and they're happening rapidly.
They are. Now, when Bob talks about 2,500 years ago and beyond, by the way, the prophets of the Old Testament looked forward to the end times. And what did they see? Well, they saw Israel in the land. They saw the elements of the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. They saw a series of latter-day wars. They talked about latter-day political events, which, Bob, we're watching right now in the Middle East, in global politics, in the economy. All of the Old Testament prophets just laid it out for us. In fact, I think people are really watching the Middle East right now, and I speak of Bible-believing Christians, more than they're watching anything else.
Well, we had 28 speakers at our conference in Colorado Springs, world-renowned experts. Israel, the subject of Israel, was one of the main themes of the entire conference. The White House's role in the Middle East, the conflict in Egypt and Syria and Iran, all of these countries that today surround Israel, and Israel is in a vice, and we believe there's a war coming. Now, we had one speaker at the conference who focused his message entirely on that upcoming war.
Absolutely. You're talking about Bill Salas, and Bill has written Psalm 83. I know that many of you have already seen the book. It's very, very popular. It's accompanied, by the way, by a DVD, by CD commentary. Bill has had the opportunity to defend his concept, the concept being that Psalm 83 lays out the enemies of Israel in a very understandable fashion, name by name by name by name. You can see the machinations of Israel's modern enemies. Now, I don't use the newspaper to analyze Bible prophecy. In fact, that's frowned upon. Newspaper exegesis, where you read the newspaper, you see what's happening, and then you try to find it in the Bible. I don't necessarily believe in that, Bob. On the other hand, what we read in the Bible today is popping up in the newspapers. For example, we have Persia, we have Syria, we have Turkey, we have Egypt. All of the countries mentioned in a Middle East conflict are popping into the foreground in very predictable fashion. Well, that's what Bill was talking about. And he's got a I think, an interesting scenario in which he's predicting a regional war in the very near future.
And I think what's interesting about Brill's presentation is how he takes every country and discusses the fate, the future biblical fate of that Middle East country. Now, there's another day coming next spring. In fact, it's right before our next prophecy conference in Orlando, Florida, next March 28th through 30th. Well, 2 weeks after our conference, Mark Biltz is going to take the stage in Orlando.
You know, years ago, when J.R. Church was still alive, J.R. and I sat in the studio with Mark Biltz, and we introduced his concept of the blood moons when nobody had ever heard about it. Mark Biltz had, I think by the grace of God, been led to study prophetic history, and he began to look at a NASA website, and he began to study lunar eclipses. And the reason he did, as he told us at that time, he said, you know, the Bible talks about blood moons. And he said, I've just been reading that an eclipse of the moon turns the moon red. And could the Bible be talking about eclipses? And so with that in his head, he went back to this NASA website. And Bob, he found a series of very, very interesting eclipses. For example, a group of eclipses called tetrads, 4 eclipses in a row, and a solar eclipse occurred in 1492-93, which was the year of the great Jewish pogroms in Spain, in which the Jews were chased out, and it really changed the entire political nature of Judaism in Europe. And then many centuries went by until 1948, 49, and another lunar tetrad group came to pass. Well, that just happened to be the year of Israeli statehood. And then the next group of tetrads came in 1967, the Six-Day War, when for the first time in a couple of millennia, the Jews once again set foot on the Temple Mount. Well, what's very, very interesting is that we now have another set of tetrads coming up, beginning April 15th of the year 2014. Bob,
2 weeks after Mark's appearance on the stage in Orlando, which makes for a very fascinating message.
It does, indeed, and I'm sure he's going to be fired up, and I know that the people who come to see him will be fired up, because there is another lunar tetrad set, including 4 lunar eclipses and a total eclipse of the sun, right in the middle of the tetrad, that will be coming in the years 2014, 2015, and his thesis is, if these tetrads have meant huge changes in Israel in the past, then it's obvious that this one that's coming up in 2014-15 will mark another huge change for Israel. What could that change be? Could it be the predicted Mideast wars that Bill Salas was talking about? Could it be something else? Well, people are curious. They want to know, and we're going to have, by the way, Mark Biltz, for you to see from time to time in the future, and that's all I'm going to say about that, except, Bob, people absolutely, I don't know how to gauge the response, but they were beyond excited at his presentation.
And I do want to make the point that we're not teaching astrology here.
Oh, no.
You know, God has used the signs in the heavens, the planets, comets, things throughout history to really indicate future events, some of them tragic events, some of them positive events. But I do remember J.R. Church's reaction to Mark's discovery. I mean, it was truly quite astonishing. Now, you know, I want to make a point. This conference that we had in Colorado Springs had 28 speakers. I mean, world-known voices on so many different subjects, on science, on archaeology, on transhumanism.
Yeah.
And this is a subject that I want you to talk about, because this is really dominating the headlines today.
Well, those of you who watch Prophecy in the News know about men like Tom Horn and L.A. Marzulli, who have written on these subjects. Russ Dizdar has written on subjects. They are a conglomerate that involves occultism in high places in our government, studies and research into transhumanism, like DARPA, one of our national research agencies, is working on creating a super soldier by genetic modification, modifying the genes of a human being so that he becomes stronger, able to operate without sleep, able to think more rapidly, able to respond more rapidly to stimuli. Can you imagine breeding a super soldier? That's called transhumanism. Well, those subjects are of great interest to people who study Bible prophecy, because Bible prophecy talks about this having happened in the days of Noah, and Jesus himself said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming days of the coming of the Son of Man. In other words, is it happening right now? Well, the answer is yes. And we had a number of speakers, Bob, who vouched for that fact.
Oh, the days of Noah. Now, you've opened up a can of worms here. Now, a lot of you who are watching today are familiar with our program. You've seen some of the conversations we have on set with guys like Tom Horn and L.A. Marzulli. You've never read the 6th chapter of Genesis today. You don't understand what happened in the ancient past. Not everyone agrees with this, Gary. It's very clear to us. It's a very controversial subject. But the 6th chapter of Genesis really is kind of a linchpin for understanding the battle between God and Lucifer. The battle for the DNA of mankind. I mean, this is God's signature on the human body, DNA. If Satan could somehow change that DNA, it opens up a real can of worms and possibilities that are just right out of a test tube. I want you to talk about Genesis 6 and talk about what L.A. Marzulli has been doing, because I think this is a key to understanding.
Indeed it is, and it all begins with the idea that prior to the flood, there was a descent onto the surface of the earth, the descent of a group of renegade, rebellious angels who came to earth with the idea of setting up and colonizing planet Earth and becoming the overlords of planet Earth. And in the process, they married human women, and they had offspring. And those offspring, Bob, were not fully human beings. They were genetic monstrosities, if you will, and thus giving rise to all of the ancient legends of chimeras, of strange animals, of strange mythologies, which a lot of people are now saying are not mythologies at all, but simply attempts to retell the story of what happened before the flood. And, of course, at the end of that story was the fact that God had to destroy the world. Why? Because everyone had become genetically corrupted. Only Noah and his family were perfect in their generations. They were saved. They were brought over into a new world to restart humanity with the promise of a coming Messiah who would come at a later date to not only to fulfill all the prophetic promises, but to restore and renew the corrupt human genome. And so L.A.'s idea, and by the way, it's an idea that's being picked up by other people like Tom Horn and Russ Dizdar talks about this a little bit. The idea is that the story of redemption is a story of genetics, if you will, or genetic manipulation by dark forces. Now, all of this sounds very spooky, but I think we've arrived at a time, prophetically speaking, when these things are actually beginning to come to pass, and therefore people are very interested in knowing what the Bible says about them. By the way, Chuck Missler talks about this very same subject.
Well, we've covered this with Steve Quayle on the program recently.
Yes, we have.
And I think it's a fascinating subject to people. In fact, if you look at a picture of L.A. Marzulli's new book, On the Trail of the Nephilim, and L.A. was one of the speakers at the Pikes Peak Summit, you see a picture of a skull on the cover, and the pictures inside are even more terrifying than the cover. What L.A. did is he went over to Peru, and the backstory of this is many, many thousands of years ago when Israel came into the Promised Land, Joshua and Caleb and the 10 spies all went into the land. And what did they see in the land? Well, they saw these gigantic monstrosities, and they said, we're like grasshoppers in their sight.
Right.
And 10 of the spies didn't want to go in and take the land, but Joshua and Caleb did. Well, they went in and they began to slaughter the giants. L.A.'s premise is that the giants kind of got wind of what was happening, that they're being killed off in droves. L.A. went over to Peru. He's crawling around in caves. He's in private museums. He's talking to locals, insiders, and what does he have? What comes out of this? Skulls and skeletons of giant creatures. Many of them purported to have red hair, double rows of teeth, 6 fingers on each hand and each toe. So he's made these discoveries. He says all the time, Bob, I'm on the trail. I'm on the trail of the Nephilim.
And that's the name of his book. And by the way, those skulls are not merely larger than usual. They are constructed differently than an ordinary human skull, with different suturing, that is where the plates of the skull join together. They're much larger. They are kind of tubular in shape rather than globular, rather than being round like our own skulls. In other words, they were an off-breed race of men. And by the way, they built giant structures, which are still available to see. Sacsayhuaman, Machu Picchu, a number of sites, and L.A. visited those sites and has a running commentary on those in his book and also in his DVDs, and that's what he talked about at the Prophecy Conference. He electrified people because we have now the evidence that what was predicted in Bible prophecy is becoming visible. In fact, there's a war going on, Bob. There's a group of people, scientists, people who operate places like the Smithsonian Institution. They're trying to cover all this up, and just about as quickly as they can.
Why would they want to do that?
Well, they would want to do that because they have a different model of human history, which is that man arose from the apes and has risen through evolution to his present dominant form, intellectually superior, tall, dark, and handsome, and all that. Now, I don't represent that, but supposedly humanity is still evolving in an upward direction. That is the propaganda. The reality is that there has been a tortured road of genetic manipulation and genetic corruption in humanity's past, and the Lord said that it's going to happen once again. Well, L.A. is on the trail of the Nephilim for sure.
He is. And, you know, we covered a lot of supernatural subjects at the conference, and I think this is really what made our conference special and unique. There were over 80 presentations at the conference. In fact, it took me close to an hour to type in all of the message titles that you'll see in Prophecy in the News magazine. It took so long my fingers hurt, but over 80 presentations at the conference on subjects that a lot of people truthfully found strange and bizarre, but tremendously interesting and fascinating. We had Barry Schwartz come to the conference, and
phenomenal.
Barry, talk a little bit about who Barry Schwartz is.
Barry Schwartz was one of the researchers who was allowed some years ago to photograph the Shroud of Turin. In fact, he was the chief photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project in Italy. And he's a Jewish gentleman, very bright, very extremely facile at doing what he does, which is microphotography. And to make a long story short, Bob, Barry Schwartz, after looking carefully at the Shroud of Turin for a long time, and probably closer than any other human being alive today, concluded that it was the burial shroud of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, this coming from a Jewish researcher.
And if you were in Barry's presentation, believe me, you'd be a believer today. To us, the shroud is not an icon. It's not something to be worshipped. But if it truly is the burial cloth of Christ, what really is it? It's proof of the resurrection, and that's what we're interested in.
I was at Barry's presentation. It was standing room only, and let me tell you what, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, because the way he tells the story, the detail that he puts into it, his own personal struggle, is saying, can this be true? Can this actually be true? And as you listen to all this unfold, Bob, it will touch your heart, I guarantee.
Well, what's really interesting to me is Barry is a Jewish man. We had a Christian man there by the name of Russ Briol.
Yeah. Russ
also spoke on the shroud. Why would we have two people at the conference speaking on the same subject? Well, Rush's perspective is the shroud is a picture of the rapture of the church.
What can I tell you? The rapture is the resurrection. And what's going to happen to us when we're resurrected? We're going to be taken up in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, as Paul puts it, and we are going to be resurrected into glorified bodies. Now, there's going to be a huge energy transfer when that happens. We are going to be filled with the glory of God, and Christ was the first to do that, the first of many, shall we say, to be saved. And he showed the way, and we're going to follow him. And the way he showed the way was by rising in a flash of light and energy on the third day, and he left his imprint on that burial shroud. And when Russ presents that story, again, you're going to be touched by it.
Well, there's a lot of controversy over the subject of the rapture. There are many people, I'm sure, watching the program today who are just completely convinced that the church is going to endure the wrath of God. And, of course, here at Prophecy in the News, we don't believe that for a second. We believe that God is going to remove us from the tribulation period that's going to come on the earth. It's going to last for 7 years. We're not going to be here to see it. And it was important to us. One of the speakers at the conference was a professor, a Greek professor by the name of David Olander, who talked. His message was entitled "The Greatness of the Rapture from a Greek Scholar's Perspective."
From the perspective of a Greek scholar who pointed out, and it was just point after irrefutable point, that the rapture has to occur prior to the 7-year tribulation. And this gentleman is not proceeding from emotion. He's not talking about something he wants to happen, although he does want it to happen. He's talking from the perspective of linguistics. He's talking from the perspective of historical interpretation. And the case that he presents is airtight for a pre-tribulation rapture. Bob, I just have to mention that I, too, am very much convinced of the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, and I presented a talk that I called First Trump, Last Trump. And the thesis is that there are two great trumpets in the Bible. The first trump, and by the way, the first place a trumpet is mentioned in Scripture is in Exodus 19. And guess what? It is the trumpeting voice of God coming down over Mount Sinai when he gives the law to Moses. Moses and the children of Israel heard a great trumpet speaking in a voice.
And they were terrified.
Absolutely. They said to Moses, "Take it away, we can't stand it."
That was the voice of God.
It was the voice of God. It was not a mechanical trumpet. It was not if you will, some little shofar. This was the voice of God. But the Bible describes it as a trumpet.
That's the first trumpet. What's the last trumpet?
Well, the last trumpet is found in 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17. It's called the trump of God. It is not an angel blowing a trumpet. And some people make the case that the last trump is the seventh in the series of trumpets that we find in the book of Revelation, trumpets of judgment. Oh, no. It's the voice of God. The first one at Mount Sinai gave the law. The second one that you find in the Bible, the voice of God, is a shout that says, "Come up here." And he takes home all of the redeemed. And it is not, again, I have to stress, it is not a trumpet blown by an angel or by a man. It is the voice of God. And so I see two trumpets in the Bible, the first trump and the last trump, and that was the name of my talk. And by the way, that last trump takes place before the 7-year tribulation. How long before? Well, we could talk about that later.
Now, that just sent a chill down my spine when you talked about that, because we're actually going to hear the voice of God calling us up to heaven.
That's right. It'll be not a trumpet in the sense that you think of one of those silver things that you hold in your hand that has keys on top of it. Not at all. It's the voice of God.
Now, that's our blessed hope.
It is.
And, one of the subjects of the conference I think that was really, really important for us to understand is it's easy to be discouraged as a Christian living in America today. We see things coming out of Washington, D.C. that are just utterly senseless. We wonder who's running this country, who's making these decisions, who's pushing Israel's needs onto the back burner. There's so many negative things we can say, except we keep that hold and focus that Jesus is coming soon. Now, we did cover a lot of issues about America. Doug Woodward's message on the Final Babylon.
The Final Babylon speaks about political and economic America in the last days, and he makes what I consider to be a very strong case for America as Mystery Babylon the Great. And by the way, that book you should read. You can also hear his presentation, which was, as all of Doug's presentations are, extremely well done. Bob, we don't have time to go on and talk about all the other presentations, but I want to tell you this. Bob has put together a couple of offers that he wants to talk to you about right now. He has a a group of DVDs that he's packaged for you, and it's called the Pikes Peak Prophecy Summit. That's a group of 5, and then we have another group of 2 over here called the Best of the Pikes Peak Prophecy Summit, and we're going to offer those to you right now.
Well, Gary called it a group of 5. I call it a group of 83. It's actually 83 presentations, everything from Gary's opening remarks to Bill Salas's dinner to Gary's closing remarks, and in between we have interviews with most of the speakers, who are, it gives you an intimate look at who these men actually are and what their message actually is. One-on-one interviews with Derek Gilbert. And the whole package, all 83 DVDs have been put together now. It's actually 83 messages on a whole series. In fact, it's almost too big to hold up and too heavy. But just so you understand what you're getting, Christmas is coming. The Pikes Peak Prophecy Summit is here. You can get all of these DVDs at a $50 discount. It's $149.95 for all 83 messages. And I do have to say, it's a one-of-a-kind offer. There's never been a prophecy conference created that has this kind of material, interesting subjects, fascinating guests, world-class speakers. Now, we also realize that not everyone can afford $150 to buy this whole prophecy conference. So what we've done is we've taken 8 of the highlight messages and put them on the Best of Pikes Peak, Volume 1, and then we've taken 8 of the second best, or maybe equally best messages, and put them on Pikes Peak, the Best of Pikes Peak, Volume 2. So you actually have 2 sets here that contain 16 messages. Each of these sets is $29.95. So we'd like to think we have something for everybody's budget. But believe me, we had a gentleman comment about why our conference sold out so quickly. And I really loved his comment because he said, well, no wonder it sold out so fast. Just look at all the incredible subjects they're talking about. People are fascinated by these things.
Bob, the speakers are experts. I'm not including myself here. I want to leave myself out. But all those other speakers at that prophecy conference were men who are at the top of their fields, respective.
Absolutely. And this is why we're having another prophecy conference, March 28th to 30th, 2014, at the Renaissance SeaWorld Hotel in Orlando. Go to prophecyinthenews.com. Get registered, get your hotel reservation in just as quickly as you can. We've made this announcement now. The people are coming in droves. We're going to have 24 speakers at the conference, and it's going to be a great event. It
is indeed. Bob, thanks for being here today. And to the rest of you, I want you to call that 800 number that you've been seeing on your screen. And it'll connect you up with someone who knows how to get these DVD offers to you. Check our website, too, prophecyinthenews.com. Bob, see you soon.
Great to be with you.
I'm Gary Stearman saying, keep looking up, everybody. Prophecy in the News is a viewer-supported program made possible by our many friends around the world. Be sure you tune in every day for breaking news and our daily prophetic news updates at prophecyinthenews.com, or follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/prophecyinthenews.